The cockpit smelled of ozone, stale coffee, and fear. Not her fear, never hers, but the ambient, clinging kind that seeped through the radio waves from the men on the ground. Captain Eva Valkyrie Rostova kept her breathing even, a slow, metronomic rhythm that defied the chaos erupting in her headset. Below her, the world was a monochrome nightmare viewed through the green glow of her targeting pod. Jagged peaks clawed at a bruised twilight sky, their slope spitting angry orange blossoms of muzzle flashes. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, bucked around her as if the air itself were trying to throw it off. It was an ugly, stubborn beast of an airplane, and she loved it more than she'd ever loved any person. It didn't judge. It just flew. Havoc 1, this is Trident lead. We are pinned. I repeat, pinned down hard. Taking effective fire from grid 297. Enemy has high ground, multiple positions. We are in a bad way down here. The word was a piece of shrapnel, delivered with the flat, professional tone of a man who was seconds away from dying and hated who he had to ask for help. Eva's jaw tightened. She knew that voice. Navy SEAL Lieutenant Commander Rick Jester Davies. The same man who, just 3 weeks ago at a pre-deployment briefing, had looked straight past her and asked her squadron commander if one of the real pilots was on standby for this mission. He'd said it with a smirk, a casual flick of dismissal that had been co-signed by the silent grins of his men. The memory was a hot coal in her gut. Trident lead, this is Havoc 1, she replied, her voice a cool, calm counterpoint to his ragged desperation. I have eyes on the ridge. I see your IR strobes. Stand by for gun run, east to west. Danger. Close. Roger, danger close. Jester's voice crackled back, stripped of all its earlier arrogance. Just get him off us. Eva's thumb hovered over the trigger on her control stick. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon, a 7-barreled behemoth that was the heart and soul of her aircraft, was ready to sing its terrible song. 30 millimeters of depleted uranium, 4,000 rounds a minute. A sound that pilots called BRRT. A sound that enemies called the devil zipper. She banked the Warthog, the heavy wings dipping into the valley, lining up the shot. Her entire world narrowed to the glowing green display, to the crosshairs she was about to lay upon the enemy. But something was wrong. A flicker on her threat display. A new signal, faint but insistent. It wasn't a standard surface-to-air missile signature. It was something else. Something sophisticated. Something that shouldn't be here, in this forgotten corner of the world. The question hung in the air, sharp and metallic. Who were these insurgents, and what were they armed with? Before she could process it, Jester's voice screamed in her ear. They are coming. Down the rocks. They're charging the position. The flicker on her screen solidified. It had. A lock. On her point 3 weeks earlier, the air at Creech Air Force Base had been thick with the scent of sun-baked asphalt and jet fuel, a perfume Eva had adored since she was a little girl. She'd grown up in a small town in Pennsylvania, the daughter of a steelworker who had filled her head with stories of American heroes and machines that could touch the sky. While other girls played with dolls, Eva built model airplanes, her fingers sticky with glue, her heart soaring with every perfectly placed decal. She'd had to fight for everything she ever got. Fight to get into the Air Force Academy, fight to get a pilot slot, fight to be assigned to the A-10, a community dominated by gruff, mustached men who saw the plane as an extension of their own. Machismo. She'd outflown, outstudied, and outworked every single one of them. And still, she found herself in rooms like this one. The briefing room was sterile and cold, the air humming with the low thrum of industrial air conditioning. It was packed with the quiet confidence of elite warriors. SEAL Team 6. The best. Of the best. They were all broad shoulders and easy, predatory grace, their desert fatigues crisp, their faces tanned and etched with the hard lines of experience. And they were all men. When Eva walked in, a ripple of something, amusement, surprise, annoyance, had passed through the room. She was used to it. At 5'6", with a lean, wiry frame and her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, she knew she didn't fit their image of a warthog pilot. Jester, their leader, had been briefing his men, his back to the door. He was handsome in a chiseled, arrogant way, with eyes the color of a winter sky. He didn't turn when she entered. He just paused, his pointer tapping a satellite image projected on the screen. All right, the air asset for this op is Havoc. Squadron, he'd said, his voice dripping with condescension. They'll be our eye in the sky. Supposedly. A few of his men chuckled. Eva had stood straight, her flight suit immaculate, her gaze fixed on the back of his head. Her commander, Colonel Masters, a man who believed in her but was perpetually exhausted by the politics of it all, cleared his throat. Commander Davies, this is Captain Rostova. Havoc 1. She'll be your primary close air support. Jester had finally turned, his eyes sweeping over her in a quick, dismissive appraisal. He looked at her wings, at the name Rostova stitched above her right pocket, and then his gaze had drifted right past her face to Colonel Masters. That's when he'd said it. No offense, Colonel, but this is a high-stakes mission. Are you sure you don't have one of the real pilots on standby? Someone with a bit more trigger time. The insult was a physical blow. It wasn't just about her gender. It was a direct shot at her competence, her years of relentless training, the countless hours she'd spent mastering one of the most difficult aircraft in the Air Force inventory. The room had gone quiet. The SEALs shuffled their feet, their smirks frozen on their faces. They were waiting to see what she would do. Would she crumble? Would she get angry? Eva did neither. She met Jester's gaze, her own eyes as hardened, unyielding as polished steel. She didn't say a word. She simply let him look at her, let him see the cold, controlled fire burning there. It was a fire he had just stoked, a fire he would one day come to pray for. She gave him a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture that said, I heard you. And you will remember this. She then turned her attention to the mission map, her focus absolute. She would not give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Her response would come later, when it mattered. It would come from the sky now, in the dark. Violent skies over that desolate mountain range. The moment had arrived. The threat warning shrieked in her ears, a high-pitched digital scream. A missile launch. But not from the ground. It was air-to-air. Impossible. There were no enemy fighters on her radar. Havoc 1, what is your status? Jester's voice was tight with panic. The charge he'd reported was now a full-blown assault. She could see it through her pod, dozens of figures swarming down the scree slope toward the SEAL's tiny, desperate island of defense. They were about to be overrun. Her instruments were lying to her. Her radar was clear, but the missile warning was real. It was a ghost, a phantom, a technological betrayal that made no sense. She had a choice to make, in a span of a single heartbeat. Break off, deploy countermeasures, and save herself from the phantom missile? Or ignore the screaming warning, trust her gut that something was wrong with her systems, and push her attack to save the men on the ground? The men who had laughed at her. The man who had insulted her. She thought of Jester's words. One of the real pilots. A grim smile touched her lips. A real pilot doesn't run. A real pilot flies into the fire. Trident lead. Get your heads down, she commanded, her voice dropping to a low, lethal growl. She ignored the blaring alarms, the flashing red lights that screamed for her to evade. She pushed the stick forward, nosing the Warthog into a steep, terrifying dive, straight into the heart of the fight, straight toward the phantom threat. The ground rushed up to meet her, a blur of rock and shadow. The sound that came next would change everything. The dive was a gut-wrenching, controlled fall. The A-10, a plane built to absorb punishment, groaned in protest as Eva pushed it past its prescribed limits. The world outside was a swirling vortex of green and black. Inside, her cockpit was a symphony of alarms, each one a shrieking voice telling her she was about to die. The missile lock warning was a solid, unwavering tone, an electronic death chant. But her eyes were fixed on the ground, on the desperate firefight unfolding below. She saw the muzzle flashes of the SEALs' rifles, sporadic and fading, like dying embers. And she saw the overwhelming tide of the enemy, a wave of darkness about to crash over them. Her instincts, honed over 1,000 hours of flight time, were screaming louder than the alarms. The missile wasn't real. It was a trick. A ghost in. The machine designed to do exactly this, to scare her off, to make her break away and leave the SEALs to be slaughtered. It was a sophisticated piece of electronic warfare, and it confirmed the suspicion that had been gnawing at her. These weren't local insurgents. This was something else entirely. Someone had armed them with technology that could challenge American air power. The question was who? And why? There was no time to find answers. There was only time to act. Her thumb found the trigger. Guns, 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 she whispered, a prayer to the god of war, The GAU-8 Avenger erupted. The entire airframe shuddered with its violent recoil, a feeling like a giant tearing a phone book in half right next to her ear. The air filled with a sound that wasn't just heard but felt deep in the bone, a thunderous, ripping beat that seemed to tear a hole in the fabric of the night. A stream of incandescent light, a river of 30mm depleted uranium rounds, poured from the nose of her aircraft. It hit the mountainside with the force of a localized meteor shower. Rock, dirt, and bodies vaporized. The charging wave of enemy fighters ceased to exist, erased from the earth in a single, brutal second. She pulled back on the stick, the G-forces crushing her into her seat. The Warthog clawed its way back into the sky, its engine screaming. The Phantom missile lock vanished. The alarms fell silent. In their place, a new sound filled her headset, the ragged, disbelieving gasps of the men she had just saved. Jesus Christ, someone breathed over the radio. It wasn't Jester. It was one of his men. Did you see that? Holy, Trident lead, this is Havoc 1, Eva said, her voice steady, betraying none of the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Report status. How copy? There was a pause, a beat of stunned silence. Then Jester's voice came back, hoarse and shaky. Solid copy, Havoc 1. Solid, copy. You got M. All of M. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, naked awe. He had been looking death in the face, and this woman, this pilot he had dismissed, had stared it down with him and made it blink. The ridge is clear, but I'm showing more movement to your north, Eva reported, her eyes already scanning. The next threat. Looks like they're regrouping. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. That gun run had been a statement, but it had also made her the single biggest target in the valley. They knew she was here, and they knew what she could do. They would come for her now. The journey to this valley had started with a quiet, simmering resolve. After the briefing at Creech, Eva had thrown herself into her work with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. She spent her days in the simulator, running through every conceivable combat scenario, pushing the virtual A-10 to its breaking point and beyond. She spent her nights poring over intelligence reports, studying topographical maps, memorizing enemy weapon capabilities. She was determined to be so good, so undeniably proficient, that no one would ever dare question her presence again. Her squadron mates watched her with a mixture of respect and concern. Easy, Valkyrie, said Major Dan Grizzly Adams, a burly, good-natured pilot who had been one of her first instructors. You're gonna burn yourself out. I'm fine, Grizzly, she'd replied, not looking up from a satellite. Photo of their designated area of operations. Just getting prepared. Prepared for what? The apocalypse. He chuckled. But he saw the look in her eyes, the hard, distant focus, and his smile faded. He knew that look. It was the look of a warrior with something to prove. He'd seen it in the mirror many years ago. The deployment had been routine at first. They were stationed at a forward operating base, a dusty, sprawling collection of tents and prefabricated buildings dropped in the middle of a hostile landscape. The days were a monotonous cycle of heat, sand, and standby alerts. Eva flew patrols, watched over convoys, and waited. She felt a strange sense of calm, a feeling of being in the right place at the right time. The A-10 was a sanctuary. In the air, she was no longer a woman in a man's world. She was just a pilot. Havoc 1. And that was all that mattered. Then the call had come in. SEAL Team 6, Jester's team, had been inserted deep into enemy territory to capture a high-value target. The intelligence suggested it would be a straightforward snatch and grab. The target was a regional warlord, and his compound was supposed to be lightly defended. The SEALs went in fast and quiet, under the cover of darkness. Eva and her wingman were assigned to provide air cover, circling in a high orbit miles away, their presence a secret unless things went sideways. Things went sideways. The intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. The compound wasn't a dusty hideout. It was a fortress. The warlord wasn't protected by a handful of bodyguards. He had a small army. And that army was equipped with more than just old rifles. They had heavy machine guns, mortars, and, as Eva had just discovered, sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities. The SEALs had walked into a trap. The initial firefight had been brutal. The SEALs, though outgunned and outnumbered, had fought with the lethal efficiency they were famous for. But they were taking casualties. The mission to capture the warlord was abandoned. It became a mission of survival. They fell back, fighting for every inch of ground, trying to reach an extraction point. But the enemy was relentless, funneling them into a narrow, rocky canyon. A kill box. That's when Jester had made the call. The call he must have dreaded making. He had radioed for air support, his voice tight with the strain of command under fire. On the command frequency, Eva had listened as the request was processed. She heard the skepticism in the voice of the Air Support Operations Center commander. "Are you sure, Trident Lead? The intel says local militia. An A-10 gun run seems excessive." "Sir, the intel is wrong." Jester had roared back, his professionalism cracking under the pressure. "We have multiple Kias, and we are about to be overrun. We need ordnance on target now." Even then, there had been a hesitation, a delay that cost lives. Eva had felt a cold fury building inside her. They were debating protocol while men were dying. Finally, her own commander, Colonel Masters, had cut through the chatter. "Launch Havoc Squadron. Valkyrie, you are weapons free." Now, circling high above the canyon, Eva watched the enemy regroup. They weren't disorganized. They moved with tactical precision, using the terrain for cover, setting up new firing positions. They were communicating, coordinating, and they were adapting. They had tried to trick her with the Phantom missile. It hadn't worked. What would they try next? A new signal appeared on her threat display. This one was different. It wasn't a ghost. It was a solid, terrifyingly real radar lock. It came from the northern ridge, the same direction the enemy forces were moving. It was a modern, mobile surface-to-air missile system. The kind of weapon a regional militia could only dream of acquiring. The kind of weapon that could swat an A-10 out of the sky like a fly. "Trident Lead, I have a confirmed SAM launch threat, North Ridge," she said, her voice tight. "They are painting me. Can you take it out?" Jester asked. "Negative." Eva replied, her mind racing. The SAM was hidden, using the terrain to mask its position. A direct attack would be suicide. She'd be shot down before she even got close. "I can't get a clean shot. I have to stay out of its engagement envelope." A heavy silence fell over the radio. The implication was clear. She could no longer provide close support. She could fly circles from a safe distance, but she couldn't dive back into the fight. The SEALs were on their own again. So that's it. Jester's voice was laced with a new kind of despair. "You're just going to leave us here?" The accusation, though unspoken, hung in the air. He thought she was afraid. He thought she was abandoning them. After everything, after she had just saved them, he still didn't trust her. The injustice of it was a bitter pill. But she couldn't let his doubt cloud her judgment. She was a pilot, and her first duty was to her aircraft. A dead pilot in a crashed plane couldn't save anyone. "I'm not leaving you," she said, her voice hard. "I'm finding another way." She scanned her instruments, her mind working through a dozen different tactical problems at once. How do you kill a monster you can't see? How do you help men you can't get close to? The enemy was smart. They had used the SEALs as bait to draw her in, and now they had sprung the trap. They had neutralized the A-10, the one weapon that could have saved the men on the ground. And then she saw it. A flicker of an idea. A wild, desperate, and incredibly dangerous plan. It involved pushing the Warthog, and herself, far beyond anything she had ever done in training. It was a maneuver with a razor-thin margin for error. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and she would become a fireball on the side of a mountain. But it was the only chance they had. "Trident Lead," she said, her voice now calm and decisive. "I have an idea. But I need you to do something for me. I need you to make some noise. A lot of it. I need you to make them look at you, not at me." "Make noise." Jester repeated, confused. "We are low on ammo. What do you want us to do?" "Anything you can," Eva urged. "Throw rocks if you have to. Just draw their fire. I need to know exactly where that SAM launcher is, and they'll only turn on its tracking radar when they have a target." "You want us to be the target?" Jester's voice was incredulous. "You already are," Eva replied softly. "This just makes it count for something." She could hear him breathing on the other end, could almost feel the weight of the impossible choice she had just given him. Sacrifice what little ammunition you have left, expose your position, and trust the pilot you disrespected to pull off a miracle. He was silent for a long moment. Eva waited, her hands steady on the controls. The fate of his men, and her own, rested on his answer. Finally, his voice came back, stripped of everything but a grim resolve. All right, Havoc 1. We'll make some noise. Then he added 2 words she never thought she'd hear him say. Be careful. The line went quiet. Eva took a deep breath and turned the A-10 away from the valley, climbing toward the thin, cold sanctuary of the upper atmosphere. She needed altitude. She needed speed. And she needed every ounce of courage she possessed. The enemy had shown their hand. Now it was her turn to play hers. But as she climbed, a new warning light began to flash on her console. It wasn't a weapon lock. It was a fuel warning. Her dive and the high-power gun run had drunk her tanks dry at an alarming rate. She didn't have enough fuel for a prolonged fight. She had enough for one more pass. One chance. If she failed, she wouldn't even have enough fuel to make it back to base. She would be stranded in the sky, a sitting duck, in the middle of a country that wanted her dead. The fuel warning was a cold knot in Eva's stomach. It transformed her desperate plan from merely dangerous to potentially suicidal. Every calculation, every maneuver, now had to be twice as precise, twice as efficient. There was no room for error, no second chances. She had one shot to take out the SAM, save the SEALs, and get out of this valley before her engine starved and her plane fell out of the sky. The weight of it all pressed down on her, heavier than any G-force. Havoc 1, we are in position, Jester's voice crackled, pulling her from her thoughts. Ready to make some noise on your command. Stand by, Trident lead, she replied, her own voice betraying none of her inner turmoil. She was still climbing, pushing the Warthog higher and higher. The air grew thin and frigid. The stars overhead were sharp, brilliant diamonds, cold and indifferent. She felt a profound sense of isolation, a feeling of being the only living soul in a vast, empty sky. But she wasn't alone. Down below, in the dark, men were counting on her. Okay, Jester, she said, finally leveling off at 30,000 feet, far above the fray. Light em up. A moment later, the dark valley floor erupted in a symphony of defiance. The SEALs opened up with everything they had left. The staccato rhythm of their rifles, the deeper cough of a grenade launcher. It was a desperate, final stand. It was also the bait. Eva watched on her targeting pod, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw the muzzle flashes from the enemy positions as they returned fire, concentrating their assault on the SEALs' location. Come on, she whispered. Take a look, and then, it happened. A new signal blossomed on her threat display. A powerful, active radar sweep coming from the northern ridge. The SAM operator, drawn in by the firefight, had activated their targeting radar to get a lock on the source of the commotion. It was a fatal mistake. The radar was a beacon, a giant electronic signpost that screamed, "Here I am. Got you." Eva breathed. Her fingers flew across her console, locking the SAM's position into her targeting computer. She had its location pinpointed to within a few meters, but it was still hidden behind the ridge. She couldn't hit it with a missile. She couldn't reach it with her guns from this altitude. She had to go down there. She had to get below it. This was the crazy part of her plan, the part that no simulator could ever truly replicate. She wasn't going to dive on the SAM from above. She was going to come at it from below, using the terrain to mask her approach until the last possible second. It was a tactic known as terrain masking, and at the speeds and altitude she was about to attempt, it was borderline insane. Trident lead, I'm beginning my attack run, she announced, her voice a flat, professional monotone. Cease. Fire and get your heads down. This is going to be loud. She rolled the A-10 onto its side and then pushed the nose down, not into a dive, but into a spiraling, high-speed descent. She kept her engines at full power, trading altitude for airspeed. The Warthog screamed toward the earth. 20,000 feet. 15,000. 10. The ground rushed up, no longer a map but a terrifying, three-dimensional reality of rock and shadow. At the last possible moment, she pulled out of the dive, leveling off just a few hundred feet above the valley floor. She was now flying inside the canyon, the rock walls a claustrophobic blur on either side of her cockpit. She was below the enemy's radar, a ghost in the mountains. The SAM couldn't see her. The enemy fighters couldn't see her. She was flying on pure instinct and skill, her hands making constant, minute adjustments to the controls, her eyes scanning the terrain ahead, looking for the narrow opening that would lead her to her target. The fuel gauge needle dipped lower. And lower, the canyon twisted and turned. It felt like flying through the belly of a snake. A single miscalculation, a moment of vertigo, and she would splatter her $30 million aircraft and herself all over the rocks. The G-forces were immense, constantly trying to pull her into a blackout. She fought them, grunting with the strain, her flight suit inflating around her legs and torso to keep the blood in her head, and then she saw it. A gap in the ridge ahead. Her path. It would take her up and over the ridge, right on top of the SAM's hidden position. She had maybe 2 seconds of exposure time before the SAM would see her, lock on, and fire. 2 seconds to acquire the target, fire her own weapon, and break away. Almost there, she muttered, her knuckles wide on. The control stick. She pulled back, and the A-10 surged upward, a grey beast climbing a waterfall of rock. She cleared the ridge, and her world exploded in light and sound. The SAM was right where she expected it to be, nestled in a small depression, its radar dish swiveling frantically to find her. The crew, caught completely by surprise, scrambled to react. But Eva was faster. She already had a Maverick missile off the rail. The missile, guided by the image she had locked in just seconds before, streaked across the short distance and slammed into the launcher. The explosion was immense, a brilliant white flower that blossomed and died in the blink of an eye, sending a shockwave tearing through the air. "Scratch one, SAM," she yelled into her radio, a surge of triumphant adrenaline washing over her. She had done it, but her triumph was short-lived. As the smoke from the destroyed missile launcher cleared, she saw something else. Something that made her blood run cold. The SAM hadn't been alone. Parked next to it, previously hidden by a camouflage net that had been incinerated in the blast, was a truck. And on the back of that truck was a command and control module, bristling with antennas and communication dishes. It was a mobile electronic warfare unit, the source of the Phantom missile lock, the brain behind the entire operation, and it wasn't destroyed. The blast had shredded its antennas, but the vehicle itself looked intact. As she watched, a figure emerged from the cabin. He wasn't dressed like the other insurgents. He wore a clean, professional-looking military uniform, and he was holding a satellite phone to his ear. He looked up at her, his face a mask of cold fury, and then he raised a hand, not in surrender, but to shield his eyes as he looked directly at her. In that moment, she saw the patch on his shoulder. It wasn't from any known militia or terrorist group. It was the insignia of a highly secretive, elite mercenary unit known as the A-10 Group. The revelation hit her with the force of a physical blow. The A-10 Group, a private army, for hire to the highest bidder. They were ghosts, officially denied by every government, yet known and feared in the dark corners of the world. They were equipped with cutting-edge, often stolen, military hardware. They were not insurgents, they were peer-level adversaries. And they were here. This changed everything. This wasn't a simple warlord's army. This was a professional military operation. But that wasn't the biggest shock. As her targeting pod zoomed in on the man's face, her heart stopped. She recognized him. She had seen that face before, with its cruel, thin lips and cold, dead eyes. He was a former US Air Force officer, a man named Colonel Redding. He had been a celebrated tactician, an expert in electronic warfare. He had also been dishonorably discharged 5 years ago for selling military secrets. He was a traitor. Redding looked at her A-10, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He knew she was low on fuel. He knew she was alone. He lifted the satellite phone to his mouth and spoke a single word. And then, Eva's world turned upside down. Every screen in her cockpit went black. Her navigation, her targeting pod, her communications, everything died. A second later, her controls went dead. The stick in her hand was loose, disconnected. The plane was no longer responding to her inputs. She was a passenger in her own aircraft. A chilling, synthesized voice filled her cockpit, speaking in perfect, unaccented English. "Good evening, Captain Rostova," it said. "Thank you for delivering my property back to me. A-10 Group now has control of this aircraft." Her A-10, her Warthog, her Sanctuary, had been hijacked. Remotely. Redding hadn't just used electronic warfare to create a ghost missile. He had used a backdoor, a hidden piece of code buried deep in the A-10's fly-by-wire system. A piece of code that he had likely put there himself, years ago. He had turned her weapon, her shield, into her cage, the plane banked, not by her command, but by his. It turned away from the valley, away from the SEALs, and began a slow, steady climb. She was being kidnapped, her $30 million aircraft stolen right out from under her. Down below, the SEALs were still trapped, their brief. Hope extinguished. And the traitor, the man who had orchestrated all of this, was now flying her plane. The ultimate act of betrayal was not just against her country, but against her, personally. He was taking her wings, and as the plane climbed, she saw the full extent of the enemy forces for the first time. On the far side of the ridge, hidden from the valley, was a massive staging area. Dozens of vehicles, hundreds of soldiers. It was an invasion force. The SEALs hadn't just stumbled into a trap, they had stumbled into the opening stages of a war. And she, the one person who could have warned the world, was now a prisoner in her own cockpit, being flown straight into the heart of the enemies. Camp, the silence in the cockpit was a living thing, heavy and suffocating. Eva's breath hitched, a ragged sound in the sudden, terrifying quiet. The synthesized voice had fallen silent, leaving her alone with the hum of the systems she no longer controlled. She was a ghost in her own machine. Her hands still gripped. The useless control stick, a reflex she couldn't stop. She could see the stars through the canopy, cold and distant. The plane was climbing, smooth and steady, a gentle, horrifying ascent into enemy territory. Panic clawed at the edges of her mind, a wild, frantic animal trying to break free. She forced it down, her years of training kicking in, a bulwark against the terror. Aviate, navigate, communicate. The pilot's mantra. But she couldn't aviate. She couldn't navigate. And her radios were dead. She was utterly, completely helpless. Or was she? Her eyes darted around the dark cockpit, searching for something, anything, that wasn't connected to the main flight computer. Redding's virus was sophisticated, a masterpiece of digital warfare. It had taken over the fly-by-wire system, the nerve center of the aircraft. But the A-10 was old. It was a relic from an earlier age, a brutal, analog beast that had been retrofitted with digital controls. And in that fact lay a sliver of hope. Not all of its systems were integrated. Some were still stubbornly, beautifully analog. Her gaze fell on the emergency jettison panel. A row of simple, mechanical switches. Below it, the manual fuel control levers. And next to them, the holy grail, the circuit breaker panel. A wall of small, black, push-pull buttons, each one a gateway to a different part of the plane's electronic soul. Redding had seized control of the primary systems, but he couldn't possibly have accounted for every single circuit. It would be like trying to map every capillary in a human body. A new plan began to form in her mind, a desperate, electrifying gamble. If she couldn't control the plane, maybe she could break it. Not enough to crash, but enough to disrupt Redding's control. She had to reboot the system. A hard reset. And there was only one way to do that. She had to systematically pull every non-essential circuit breaker, starving the corrupted flight computer of the information it needed, forcing it into a state of catastrophic failure. It was the digital equivalent of inducing a seizure to stop. A runaway heart. The risk was astronomical. She could accidentally cut power to something vital. She could send the plane into an unrecoverable spin. And she would have to do it blind, with no instruments to guide her. But it was better than the alternative, handing over one of the most powerful weapons in the US arsenal to a traitor. Her radio crackled to life. Not the synthesized voice, but Redding's own, dripping with smug satisfaction. "Don't bother, Captain," he said, his voice echoing slightly, as if from a large command center. "You can't win. I designed the system. I know every line of code. I know you're low on fuel. In a few minutes, you'll be over my base. You'll land. And we'll have a nice, long chat about all the other backdoors I've hidden in your Air Force's toys." His arrogance was a mistake. It was the fuel she needed. It ignited the cold knot of fear in her stomach and turned it into pure, white-hot rage. He was so sure of himself, so convinced of his own genius, just like Jester had been. It was the fatal flaw of arrogant men. They always underestimated the woman in the cockpit. "You talk too much, Redding," she snarled, her voice a low growl. Her hands flew to the circuit breaker panel. She started pulling. Cabin lights. Non-essential avionics. Backup displays. Each pull was a small act of rebellion. The plane shuddered. A warning light flickered and died. "What are you doing?" Redding's voice lost some of its swagger. There was a note of confusion in it now. "You're going to tear the plane apart." "It's not your plane," Eva shot back. She pulled another breaker. And another. The plane lurched violently to the left. She was flying by the seat of her pants, feeling the aircraft's distress through the vibrations in her spine down in the valley Jester and his men had heard. Her last transmission about the SAM. They had seen the explosion. For a glorious moment, they had thought they were saved. But then, they had watched in horror as Havoc 1, instead of turning back to help them, had climbed and flown away, deeper into enemy territory. "What the hell is she doing?" One of the SEALs yelled over the sound of incoming fire. "She's running. She's leaving us." "No," Jester said, his voice quiet but firm. He didn't understand what was happening, but he had seen what she had done. The dive. The gun run. The insane, brilliant attack on the SAM. That wasn't the flying of a coward. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. "She's not running," he repeated, more to himself than to his men. "Havoc 1, do you copy? Valkyrie, talk to me." Only static answered. The enemy, emboldened by the departure of the A-10, had renewed their assault with a vengeance. The SEALs were cornered, their backs to a sheer cliff face. Their ammunition was almost gone. They were making every shot count, but it was a losing battle. The darkness was closing in. Jester looked at the faces of his men, grimy with sweat and cordite, their eyes wide in the gloom. These were the toughest men he had ever known, and they were going to die here, in this forgotten pile of rocks. And it was his fault. His arrogance, his dismissal of the one person who could have saved them, had set this tragedy in motion. The weight of his failure was a physical thing, crushing the air from his lungs. He raised his rifle, ready to sell his life as dearly as possible. High above, Eva was in her own fight for survival. The A-10 was bucking like a wild horse. Alarms, silent for minutes, now screamed back to life as systems failed and rebooted chaotically. Redding was fighting her, trying to regain control, but she was too fast, too unpredictable. She was pulling. Breakers at random, sowing chaos in the code. "Stop it." Redding screamed over the radio. Now he was the one who sounded desperate. "You'll kill us all." "That's the idea," she screamed back, pulling the last breaker she could reach, and then everything went silent. The engine sputtered. The lights died. The controls in her hand, which had been fighting her, went completely slack. For a terrifying, heart-stopping second, the A-10 was no longer an airplane. It was a 30,000-pound glider, falling out of the sky in the dead of night. She had done it. She had forced a total system failure. She had rebooted the beast. The emergency power unit kicked in, a small turbine that whined to life, providing just enough hydraulic pressure to move the control surfaces. The flight computer, its corrupted memory wiped clean, began its slow, agonizingly long boot sequence. For now, she was flying on pure mechanics. No computers. No fly-by-wire. Just cables, pulleys, and her own skill. This was how the old pilots flew. This was flying in its purest form. She pushed the stick forward, nosing the plane into a controlled dive to maintain airspeed. The engines, starved of their computer-controlled fuel flow, were still dead. She had to restart them. Manually. She reached for the ignition sequence, her heart hammering against her ribs. The ground was coming up fast. She was still deep in enemy territory. And her fuel was critical. She had maybe 5 minutes of flight time left, if she could even get the engines back on. The first engine caught. A low rumble that grew into a roar. Then the second. She pulled back on the stick, leveling out just a few thousand feet above the jagged peaks. Her screens flickered back to life, one by one. The flight computer was back online. Clean. Hers. "This is Havoc 1, she said, her voice shaking but triumphant. "I'm back." There was no response from Redding. She had cut him off. She was alone again. She banked the plane hard, turning it back toward the valley. Back toward the SEALs. She didn't know if they were still alive. She didn't know. if she had enough fuel to make it. But she had to TR wide at AS. She raced back. A new message appeared on her main display. Not from Redding. It was an automated data link transmission from another US asset. A drone, high overhead, had been monitoring her flight. It sent her a single, encrypted data packet. She opened IT was a satellite image of Redding's base, and in the center of the base was a large, heavily guarded hangar. The drone's thermal imaging showed what was inside. It wasn't a plane. It was a missile. A long-range ballistic missile, mounted on a mobile launcher. The kind that could carry a non-conventional warhead. The truth crashed down on her. Redding wasn't just selling weapons. He wasn't just helping a warlord. He was here to launch a devastating attack. The SEALs hadn't just stumbled into a war. They had stumbled upon a false flag operation of catastrophic proportions. Redding was going to use the missile to start a war between two nations, and the Ars group would be there to profit from the chaos. The SEALs were just loose ends he needed to clean up, and now he knew that she knew. He had lost control of the A-10, but he still had his missile. And he had an army. The time for subtlety was over. He would launch. Soon, her fuel light was no longer flashing. It was a solid, angry red. The gauge was on empty. Her engines could flame out at any second. She had a choice. She could use her last few drops of fuel to try and save the SEALs. Or she could try to transmit the information about the missile, to warn the world about the impending catastrophe. She couldn't do both. The clock was ticking. Men were dying. And a war was about to begin. The choice was a blade with two edges. And both cut her to the bone. Save the men she could see, or save the millions she couldn't. Her training, her duty, screamed one answer. The strategic threat was the priority. Warn command about the missile. That was the logical, correct decision. But logic had no place in the heart of a warrior. Her eyes flicked to the targeting pod display. The SEAL's position was being hammered by mortar fire. Their IR strobes were faint, flickering. One of them went out. Then another. They were being wiped out. She thought of Jester's face, his arrogance stripped away, leaving only a desperate man trying to keep his brothers alive. She thought of his last words to her. Be careful. He had seen her, finally. Not as a woman, not as a risk, but as a pilot. As their only hope. To abandon them now would be to abandon a part of herself, too. Hell with logic, she whispered. Her decision was made. It wasn't a choice between duty and emotion. It was a choice to redefine her duty. She would not let her brothers-in-arms die alone in the dark. Not while she still had wings. Trident lead. This is Havoc 1. Do you read me? She transmitted, her voice sharp, urgent. The response was a burst of static, then Jester's voice, weak and strained. Havoc 1, you're back. There was no accusation, only a profound, weary relief. I'm on my way, she said. But I'm running on fumes. I've got one pass, Jester. One. Make it count. Pop smoke on the primary threat. They're everywhere, he yelled over an explosion that made the radio distort. Mortars on the ridge. Heavy machine gun. Nest in the rocks below. We're. His voice was cut off. Jester. Talk to me. Eva screamed, silence. Then, a different voice, younger, panicked. Trident lead is down. Jester's hit. The words hit Eva harder than any missile. A cold dread washed over her, followed by a volcanic surge of fury. Redding had done this. That traitor, with his games and his arrogance, had taken down one of America's finest. This is for you, Jester, she growled, her thumb moving to the weapon selector. She didn't have enough fuel for a gun run. She had one Maverick missile left and a rack of unguided rockets. She had to make them count. She dove back into the canyon, the warthog screaming its defiance. The fuel warning was a constant, piercing tone in her ears. The engines could quit at any moment. She ignored it. Her world had narrowed to one single, burning purpose. Vengeance. She saw the green smoke blossom in the rocks below the SEALs. Position. The machine gun nest. That was her first target. She lined up the shot, her movements precise and economical. Rocket ripple, now, she commanded herself. A stream of rockets leaped from their pods, streaking across the darkness and obliterating the nest in a series of thunderous explosions. As she pulled up, she saw the mortar teams on the ridge, silhouetted by the fire she had just started. They were turning their tubes, trying to track her. She had one Maverick left. She locked it on the largest group, whispered, "Good night," and squeezed the trigger. The missile flew true. The ridge erupted in a fireball that lit up the entire valley. She had done it. The primary threats were neutralized. She had given the SEALs a fighting chance. But her engines chose that exact moment to die the roar of. The twin turbofans spooled down into a ghostly whistle. The plane, its momentum spent, began to fall. She was a glider again, but this time there would be no restart. She was out of fuel. Utterly, completely empty. Havoc 1 is going down, she said into the radio, her voice impossibly calm. I repeat, I am ejecting. She reached for the yellow and black stripe handle between her knees. Her last act. But as her fingers brushed the cold metal, she saw something on her now powerless screen. A residual image burned into the phosphorus. It was the feed from her targeting pod, from its last moments of power. It showed Redding's base. And the hangar. The missile hangar. The doors were open. The missile was being raised to firing position. He was launching. Now she couldn't eject. If she did, the plane would crash into the mountainside. But if she stayed, if she could guide it, the valley opened up ahead of her. Beyond it, a stretch of desert. And beyond that, just a few miles away, was Redding's base. She was a falling brick, but she was a 30,000-pound brick aimed in the right direction. She didn't have an engine, but she had gravity. And she had a target. Negative, negative, she said into the radio, her voice tight with a terrifying, new resolve. I am not ejecting. Trident team, if you can hear me, tell my father I love him. She took control of the falling plane, using its last vestiges of hydraulic pressure to guide its descent. It was no longer an attack run. It was a suicide run. She was going to turn her beloved Warthog into a makeshift bomb and ram it into Redding's. Missile, the ground rushed up to meet her. The base grew larger in her canopy. She could see men running, pointing up at her. They thought she was crashing. They had no idea she was attacking in his command center. Redding watched her on his radar screen, a look of disbelief on his face. She's not ejecting, he muttered. What is she doing? Then his eyes widened in horror as he realized. Her trajectory. No, he whispered. You wouldn't. Eva smiled, a grim, final smile. Real pilots don't run, she said to the empty cockpit. She held the plane steady, aimed directly at the hangar. This was it. This was the end. She closed her eyes and then, a new voice filled her headset. A voice she thought she'd never hear again. Valkyrie, don't you do it. It was Jester. He was alive. Jester, she gasped, her eyes flying open. I'm here, he said, his voice weak but clear. The medic patched me up. We saw what you did. We're okay. The exfil chopper is on its way. Now get the hell out of that plane. His voice, the fact that he was alive, that his men were safe, broke the spell. She had saved them. She had won. She didn't have to die, but the missile was still there. It was almost vertical. Suddenly, a new variable entered the equation. A second A-10, her wingman, Grizzly, who had been held on standby, screamed over. The ridge. He must have launched the second her fuel situation became critical. Havoc 2 is on station, Valkyrie. Grizzly's voice boomed. And I brought presents. Looks like you left me a target. Eva saw it all in a split second. Her falling plane. The missile. And Grizzly, lining up a perfect shot. But there was a problem. Her plane was in his way. If he fired, he might hit her. Grizzly, no, she yelled. The trajectory is too close. Trust me, kid, he said. In that moment, Redding made his final, fatal mistake. Panicked, he gave the order to fire the missile, hoping to launch it before Grizzly could shoot. The massive rocket ignited, its engines roaring to life. This was the twist Eva and Redding hadn't seen. The missile wasn't just a target anymore. It was a thruster. As it began to lift off its launcher, the force of its own exhaust, contained within the semi-enclosed hangar, created a massive, unstable pressure wave. The entire structure buckled. Grizzly fired. Not at the missile, but at the base of the hangar. His GAU-8 tore through the building supports at the exact moment the pressure wave hit. The result was catastrophic. The hangar imploded, collapsing inward, tipping the still-firing missile off its vertical axis. The ballistic missile, now out of control, slammed sideways into Redding's command center. The world turned white. The explosion was nuclear in scale, a silent, blinding flash followed by a shockwave that tossed Eva's falling A-10 like a leaf in a storm. She fought for control, but there was none. The plane was torn apart around her. The last thing she remembered was the sound of the canopy shattering and the feeling of being thrown into the violent, empty sky. She woke up in a hospital bed. The first thing she saw was the bland, white ceiling tiles. The first thing she smelled was antiseptic. The first voice she heard was a familiar, gravelly one. "Welcome back, Captain." She turned her head. Colonel Masters was sitting by her bed. Next to him stood a figure in a hospital gown, his arm in a sling, his face bruised but his eyes clear. "It was Jester. You did good, Rostova," Masters said, a rare smile on his face. "You saved those men. And you stopped a war before it started. Redding and the entire R's group command structure were wiped out. It's over." Eva tried to speak, but her throat was dry. Jester stepped forward and handed her a cup of water. She drank, her eyes never leaving his. She started. "Don't," he said, cutting her off. He looked down at the floor, then met her gaze. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a deep, profound respect. "I was wrong," he said, his voice quiet and heavy with sincerity. "About everything. You're not just a real pilot, Eva. You're the best damn pilot I've ever seen. You saved my life. You saved my men. Thank you." He stood there for a moment longer, then turned and walked out of the room, leaving her with the weight of his words. It was a victory more satisfying than any medal. It was the respect she had fought for, earned not in a briefing room with words, but in the sky, with fire and courage. Weeks later, back at Creech, Eva stood on the flight line, watching a new A-10 being prepped for flight. Her A-10. She had been cleared to fly again. As she approached the plane, she saw a group of pilots gathered near the cockpit. It was the men from her squadron. And standing with them, looking awkward but determined, were the surviving members. Of SEAL Team SIX.AS. She got closer. They all turned to face her. Grizzly stepped forward, grinning. "We made a little modification to your new ride, Valkyrie." He pointed to the nose of the Warthog. Just below the cockpit, where pilots often painted mission markings or names, was a newly stenciled piece of art. It was a detailed, fearsome depiction of a mythological Valkyrie, a warrior woman with wings of steel, carrying a lightning bolt in her hand. And below it, in sharp, bold letters, was the plane's new, official name, submitted and approved by a joint recommendation from the Air Force and Naval Special Warfare Command. It read, "Jester's Folly." Eva stared at it, a slow smile spreading across her face. She looked over at the SEALs. Their faces were solemn, but their eyes were full of respect. It was more than an apology. It was a tribute, a legend, born in the fire of that dark valley. Her legend. She climbed the ladder, settled into the familiar embrace of the cockpit, and took a deep breath. It smelled of ozone, coffee, and victory.